I met Ricardo over almost 40 years ago now. And we met through a case of mistaken identity on the telephone. Long story. And my mother used to call such meetings divine appointments, and in this case, it definitely was. Because when I stepped into your orbit, it changed the trajectory of my life in ways that are still unfolding now. I learned so many things from being in your vicinity. Chief among them was that there's a role for artists in social change. And witnessing how you have walked and lived that role for these last almost 4 decades has been a huge privilege. To witness your brilliance, faithfulness, generosity, and love in action. And also, so damn gorgeous what you make. Thank you for bringing the gift you are to my beloved community. So glad you came. And thanks for bringing Paula, your honey.
Hi, y'all. My name is Ricardo, and I sometimes describe myself as a healer and trickster organizer disguised as an artist, which sounds a little grandiose, but it's an idea of what I aspire to. So I'm going to tell some stories and share some pictures that give an idea of how I've navigated those waters of social change and art. I brought more pictures than I can possibly tell stories about, so some of them will move through fairly quickly and others I will linger on. But I'm starting with this slide here. So this is Ella Baker, mentor and leader in the civil rights movement. And she says, in order to see where we are going, we must not only remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. And I'd like to start with that because, well, I don't know if I even really need to explain. We're going through times where we really need to draw on our collective memories in order to be able to figure out what's happening around us. Speaking of history, we'll start with a little bit of introduction of mine. Oh, this is a feisty little program. So that's a picture of me with an image of the house that I grew up in Puerto Rico, the house where we lived when I was born, in the western mountains of Puerto Rico. That's a close-up of that section. The only known photo of me working on the land. That's pretty intense. And this is another image of my area where I grew up in the western mountains. These are neighbor kids bringing water up from the spring down in the valley. And my sister and I would go down and play tag with them while the buckets filled. But we lived on the top of the mountain, so we got all our rainwater off the roof because I was too far to walk with the buckets. A few more images of my home country. This one I did just a few weeks ago when we were back there. That's on the land where I grew up. And I grew up in an environment where there was no television, barely any radio, no other media, so that my TV, my school, my entertainment, my sports were basically the forest. And in the forest, you can't fast forward to the good part. If a bird lays an egg, you can't just go, and there's the egg hatching like you can on a nature show. So what I really internalized was the way in which the world moves in rhythms and tides and ebbs and flows. And if a depression in the ground fills up with water faster than it depletes, it overflows. If it depletes faster than it fills, then it empties. And although I didn't know it at the time, I was internalizing also how we are part of those cycles. And that's the knowledge that I brought with me when we moved, when I was a young preteen, to Chicago from Puerto Rico. This is a story about this, part of a series that my sister and I did for people in our neighborhood, and it shows the way the land used to be forest grown, the agriculture, the coffee, the bananas grown under forest cover until the government started basically forcing farmers to clear cut the land in order to get an extra crop per year at the price of erosion and pests and the need to bring in chemicals and herbicides to keep down the weeds and so forth. No se vende, I mean, it's not for sale. I made this after Hurricane Maria devastated much of the country, and Bitcoin billionaires and Silicon Valley bros were swooping in to buy up land from desperate farmers, and this is a reminder that our land is not for sale. And in fact, most of the conflict in the world today is about some people wanting to take what other people have. And fundamentally, that usually comes down to land, the resources in the land, or the labor power of the people who live on the land. This is a poster for a movie. I made the poster, not the movie, about farmers in Puerto Rico trying to get access to land for organic and natural and community-based farming, and the obstacles that they face. While again, U.S. investors or people from here, white folks coming in, the government rolls out the red carpet for them. Basic colonialism 101. This, believe it or not, is little old me. My hair doesn't do that anymore. I wear hats. And that was when we moved to Chicago. This is when I was about 15, the year that I moved out of home. And this is a cartoon that I made when I was about 15 or 16, the brief moment I spent in high school. And already the theme of people being played against each other, of division and unity was starting to become central to my experience. I became involved in doing support work with the Puerto Rican street gang that had become a community organization called the Young Lords, who built a coalition with the Black Panther Party that they called the Rainbow Coalition. And what I really learned from that was really profound. They made an alliance with this white street gang, the Young Patriots, who wore Confederate flags on their clothes and who had Klan family members back in Appalachia. And instead of figuring out how to isolate them, they wanted to know why these white kids were hurting in a system set up for white folks. And they came up with the brilliant and underused strategy to find out, and that was that they asked them. And ultimately built a strong coalition around housing, around rat-infested apartments, around underfunded schools, no job prospects, and all the rest that all these communities were facing. In fact, these white kids were not considered white by the Chicago police. They were thought of as hillbillies. And that time also, I was fortunate to encounter a community youth group that was open to all the kids, any youth in the community, called LRY, that was run by the Unitarians. And that was, I don't know if there's any LRY alum here, but at the time, at least in the late 60s, early 70s, it had very light touch adult supervision, which meant that it was a remarkable refuge for kids who had moved out of home or otherwise didn't have strong family ties, and a leadership development school that I really am grateful for. So all those groups that I just mentioned were dealing with that issue of land. They were dealing with gentrification, which at that time was called urban renewal. Some of the Puerto Rican families behind the Young Lords had to move like 5 times in a period of 7 years, as each neighborhood got targeted by the authorities for development. It's the same story whether it's in Detroit, on the Great Plains, in Palestine. And these are repetitions of history, right? The thing that we've been experiencing here, the rise of authoritarianism, of dictatorial aspirations and repression, the ICE invasion that we had this winter, these are all part of the repetition. They've all been part of the U.S. system from the very beginning. However, they've been outsourced to the global south, to the far reaches of the empire. And the only difference now is that the chickens are coming home to roost, as Malcolm would say. So whether in Chile, Central America, etc., we have a great deal of experience dealing with these kinds of things if we expand the definition of we beyond the confines of the U.S. nation to the entirety of the U.S. empire. And it's all about this. Them as got want more from them as have very little. My first direct experience with the way power works and the way people are divided was when I was a janitor in a hospital in Boston, when I made this lino cut in the late 70s, mid-70s, where each department was ethnically defined. Black women in the laundry, Mexican women in the kitchen, Caribbean people mostly, and African Americans in janitorial, white folks in the transportation department, and so forth. And I'm bringing this is something I learned recently during the internment of Japanese, which again we see echoes of today in the 1940s. I found from a friend who was doing the research that this was really, the driving force behind that was California, Oregon, and Washington agribiz, because Japanese workers were gaining too much organizing in the fields, and Japanese small farmers were cutting into their business. So they really pressured President Roosevelt to expel the Japanese from the land, assuring them that that would not cause any labor shortage. But as soon as it happened, they started lobbying for the Bracero program to bring in replacement workers. When I moved to Minneapolis, I started actively doing screen printing for local movements, including helping to form a group called the Northland Poster Collective, which Barbara was part of that trajectory. And creating art, like I said, for local struggles. This is about the struggle in the Black Hills area to prevent the strip mining of gold, of uranium and coal. And it was, again, an alliance between ranchers and farmers. In New Orleans, after Katrina, I was asked to make a poster to help develop a campaign uniting black New Orleansians and the Central Americans and Mexicans who had rebuilt the city and who are now being expelled by the immigration once the work had been done, and the black families who came back to find out that the housing had been raised and the schools privatized and so forth. I'll move a little faster here. This is a poster about an elder in my community who started working in the coffee plantations, that very plantation, in fact, when he was 12. And when my daughter and I brought this poster to the community, we found out that he had died 2 months before. But we got the family's blessing to release this into the neighborhood. And some of the far-flung households of that family created altars in his memory around it because they had no photos of him. So the scale at which this art can be used to meet what people need in their hearts, whether it's on the scale of a nation or a family, is quite remarkable. And a lot of it comes down, the healing aspect, the medicinal aspect, to honoring people as they are and understanding them as best we can. This is made for youth caught up in the gang system, not talking at them, not talking over them, not talking about them, but to them. Put down the piece. Take up the piece. Put together the pieces. Because no one wants to bury their best friend. This is a book cover for poetry for incarcerated youth. A poster, a dear friend of mine, Simone Senegal's, the indigenous missing and murdered campaigns. And these are all built on relationships and on looking for where the medicine is needed. In this case, when Trayvon Martin, a young black teenager, was murdered by a vigilante in Florida, people asked, are you going to make a poster about that? And he said, what? No, I'm not a reporter. I don't make posters about everything that happens. I fill gaps. And when I looked out and saw a lot of the art that was being created, it was all hopeless. It was all like, nothing ever changes. You know, nothing has changed since Emmett Till in the 60s. It keeps happening, which has an element of truth, but it's not medicinal. When you simply retell a traumatizing story over and over again, it's simply rehearsing it. So I went and found a quote, again by Ella Baker, that speaks to the fact that, yes, this keeps happening, but it looks forward to a time when it no longer will. And Trayvon's family reached out for signed copies to use. People put it on boards to carry as signs in Ferguson, Missouri, during the uprising there. Again, in the environmental justice movement, as that movement emerged and got a name and brought into vision, into the field of vision of each other, people dealing with asthma in Chicago due to coal dust, and workers on Navajo reservation dealing with uranium mining toxicity. All of these different campaigns became unified under that slogan, environmental justice. And again, I looked around, and the only art I could see were PowerPoints with graphs about cancer rates among children in Louisiana, etc. But nothing with poetry. So I created, again, something that can speak to the heart and not just the head. Which, again, I'm grateful was taken up by that movement. And this is happening now in Memphis. They're trying to prevent Elon Musk from building the world's largest data center, which will be similar to the ones he's already running on dozens of illegal and unlicensed generators that are causing tremendous pollution. And when we're talking about building alliances and environmental justice, it can't just be about us. We share this planet with a lot of other creatures. So this poster, that planet that you're warming, it isn't yours to warm, is a way of saying that we are not protecting, we don't want to save the bees because they're our little farm workers and we depend on them. We want to be in solidarity with the bee people because they have as much of a claim to this world as we do. Begin with research. This is my research cow. Don't ask me why. At least not today. Everybody should have one. But it's what we do, right? When any situation that we're faced with, we try to figure out what's going on. If we're going to cross the street, we look both ways, right? These are forms of research. My research really in what I do, kind of one of the main sources of it was when I was a young person hitchhiking around the country and had to be sitting in a small car with a right-wing army colonel for 200 miles. And I had to find out what layer, geological layer of belief I had to go down to find common ground. Because I had two promises I had made myself. Hitchhiking out in those times, I wasn't going to lie about what I believed, and I wasn't going to get myself killed. And these live in dynamic tension with each other. But that also means that the work that I do, the work that we all do if we're working for justice, is deeply based in curiosity. Who are the people around us? What makes them behave the way they do? What makes other creatures in our environment behave the way they do? What about the other people on the bus that we ride to work? These are images from a series that were actually mounted in buses in the Twin Cities. 100 signs and 100 buses, and then every month for 6 months we would switch it out with questions for the people to ask each other, or at least to wonder about each other. In the early days of the pandemic, I created these, and I work with a group. I work with co-workers in my studio in Minneapolis. But I created these images, basically instructions about what to do in the pandemic from the perspective of other species. I'll just share a few of the images that were on that poster. And found out that teachers and parents and therapists and others not only here but in other parts of the world, reached out and said, this is the first things we found that can explain to a 5-year-old what to do in a pandemic in a way that's not frightening. And that's comforting. And people went wild. They made hook rugs out of it. They dressed up their dogs as these animals. One teacher did that, and every week she'd dress up her dog as one of these animals, send the images to her remote first grade class. I don't need to explain this one. And a lot of the question in our mind these days that I'm finding is, what do we do next? What do we do given the changes? And given the way it feels for many people that the land has been snatched out from under us. And part of that research is understanding the rhythms and the repetitions in history, right? I noticed in the Twin Cities where I live, there were two currents really coming into the streets, coming into the movement of resistance. Those who were coming in, who were shocked that things are happening that violate everything this country has always stood for. And people who came in because they recognized what was happening as an expression of what this country has always stood for. And that depends a lot on what community you come from. For example, ICE. There's nothing that ICE has been doing that municipal police departments have not been doing every year since the end of the Civil War. And so understanding these things, it can provide guidance in terms of where we want to go, how we want to go, what we want to create. This is one of the moments that has fed into the current moment is the uprising around George Floyd. A piece of that history that itself is based on other histories. A poster here that I made with a coworker depicting a century of struggle in the 20th century, which is now already a quarter century behind us. And these are our legacies that we build on. Or to put it in a cuter way, that we need to know who we are. We need to know where we've been. This is about mentorship. We need to talk about it. Once we know who we are, we can bring that to the table of conversation with others. And see how the things that matter to each of us matter to all of us, which is what I learned from the Black Panthers in Chicago 5 decades ago. And then knowing that we have these commonalities, it means that the organizing that we do needs to have a shared drumbeat under it. This is my Seeds of Resistance seed packet. Grassroots mix, best when planted together, will grow under any conditions. One of the things they learned in New Orleans as the Black and Latinx communities started working together, using that poster as an anchor, but marching for housing, for all these things. The name of their campaign was The Right to Remain with Dignity. And they started sharing food and sharing songs and building community, which is what turns transactional solidarity into deep solidarity, curiosity into love. And it all comes down to stepping outside of our comfort zones and sitting down and communicating with people. It doesn't mean that somebody pointing a shotgun at you is a good time to say, hey, let's have coffee together. But it is important to understand the underlying layers that make that position that they are taking logical within the framework of their beliefs. And I just want to read you this closing poster. It says, a wetland receives the water that flows into it and slows it down, allowing sediments to drop to the bottom. It absorbs the excess nutrients, while plant roots and microbes break down harmful chemicals. Then it passes the water on, cleaner and safer, to those downstream. Be a wetland. And this can refer to cleansing ourselves of intergenerational trauma, of historical trauma. It can be parenting. Certainly those of us who have or have had children try to prevent the toxicities, the harms that we've inherited from passing on to them. And among our peers. We don't have to radiate out the traumas we've experienced to others. But it's a reminder that these things are possible. And nature provides guidance, really, for, if we learn how to look at it, observe it, interpret it, it tells us things about changing systems, about change in general, about mutuality, about even where there's conflict in nature, it's conflict based on mutual benefit as well. So that a conflict in nature is not a species trying to eliminate another, but just trying to manage the tensions of that relationship. You have the desert tobacco, for example, is pollinated by a particular moth, the sphinx moth. And it depends on that pollination, but the sphinx lays its larva on the same plant that then eats the leaves. And then the plant has to send out a chemical to bring in other insects that will eat the larva. And if that's not enough, then it switches its flowering from evening to morning, stops putting out scents that attract bees or butterflies, and puts out color that attracts hummingbirds. Right? So that is the nature of the world we live in, and these binaries of good guys and bad guys don't serve us very well, and that's my time. So thank you very much.